In the spring of 1942, Japan believed the Pacific was theirs. Yet deep in a cramped room at Station HYPO, American codebreakers had uncovered a secret so explosive it could rewrite the war. What happened next wasn't just a clash of fleets. It was a collision of pride, disbelief, and fate. Japan's victories after December 7, 1941, seemed unstoppable. In a matter of weeks, the Philippine archipelago fell to a relentless tide of troops and aircraft. Singapore, once called the Gibraltar of the East, crumbled under coordinated land and sea assaults, and the Dutch East Indies, oil-rich islands, were seized almost without resistance. The Japanese Imperial High Command, flush with success, believed they were on a 6-month march toward domination, a period they assumed would leave the United States crippled, disorganized, and powerless to respond. Confidence verged on arrogance. In Tokyo, plans were drawn on maps with a certainty born of victory. At the center of this tempest stood Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a strategist of rare vision. He understood the dangers posed by America's industrial capacity long before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Yet even a man of Yamamoto's intellect was constrained by the rigid hierarchies and internal rivalries of the Imperial Navy. Political considerations often outweighed pure strategy. Some in Tokyo argued for a cautious consolidation of gains. Others pushed for the audacious elimination of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, believing that a decisive blow now would prevent a protracted war they feared they could not win. Yamamoto navigated these currents with the calm of a chess master, yet he knew that time was an enemy as well as an ally. Across the Pacific, in the hushed corridors of Pearl Harbor, another kind of battle was beginning. While the American Navy regrouped, bruised but unbroken, a small team of codebreakers was quietly awakening to the invisible war in the ether. Station HYPO, located in a nondescript building in Hawaii, was commanded by Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort. Within its cramped, dimly lit rooms, analysts hunched over primitive decoding machines and stacks of intercepted messages, eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. Every break, every subtle pattern could tip the scales between disaster and survival. The atmosphere was one of relentless focus. The hum of typewriters and the scratch of pencils formed a background symphony to the urgent work of intercepting Japan's hidden plans. Each decrypted symbol, each repeated phrase, carried the weight of lives yet to be lost or saved. It was here, amidst cigarette smoke and the clatter of Morse code, that a faint anomaly began to emerge: strange traffic patterns in Japanese communications, repeatedly pointing to a cryptic operation labeled only as AF. The significance was not yet clear, but Rochefort sensed that the pieces were moving into place. Outside, the Pacific swirled with the remnants of Japanese triumph. Inside HYPO, an entirely different battle for intelligence and survival was quietly unfolding. No one in Japan imagined that their encrypted whispers were already echoing through American headphones. A shadow had fallen over the Pacific, unseen, silent, but growing ever more decisive. The war that raged across the Pacific was not only fought with steel and fire, but also in silence, within rooms filled with pencil-stained papers and the low hum of primitive decoding machines. At Station HYPO, the battle against the Imperial Navy's encrypted communications had become a war of intellect, patience, and sheer stubbornness. The Japanese used JN-25, a cipher of extraordinary complexity, changing its codebooks with brutal regularity. Each message was a mosaic of numbers, symbols, and deliberate obfuscation, designed to hide the movements of carriers, battleships, and supply convoys from prying eyes. Analysts hunched over decoding sheets in dimly lit rooms, faces illuminated by the green glow of blackout lamps. Bowls of cold noodles sat abandoned at desks, untouched between shifts, as the men and women labored to reconstruct elusive keys and patterns. Sleep was scarce, stolen in fragments on the edges of chairs or under scattered piles of intercepted transmissions. Every partial break, every repeated figure, carried the weight of human lives. One misread number could mean the difference between ambushing a Japanese task force and walking straight into disaster. Slowly, painstakingly, HYPO began to piece together the skeleton of a larger operation. Partial decrypts hinted at a fleet movement of unprecedented scale, striking across the Central Pacific. The Americans could estimate numbers: 4 Japanese carriers, their screening cruisers and destroyers, the entire air complement ready to launch. But the destination remained obscured, an elusive shadow labeled only as AF. Each breakthrough brought exhilaration, tempered by the crushing awareness that Washington remained skeptical. High Command insisted, over and over, that AF could be anywhere New Guinea, the Aleutians, even an entirely fictional code word. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort, resolute and stubborn, refused to accept ambiguity. He proposed a calculated risk, a ruse that would prove the target without endangering lives. Midway, still largely a backwater outpost, sent an uncoded report of a water shortage. Days passed with tense anticipation. Then, across the Atlantic cables and Pacific airwaves, a coded reply came from Tokyo, unmistakable in its simplicity. AF is short on water. The veil had lifted. HYPO had found Midway. Relief coursed through the small team, but it was intertwined with a profound burden. The knowledge that thousands of lives would hinge on the intelligence they had unearthed was heavy. Their victory was silent, invisible, yet more consequential than any naval bombardment. Every decision from this point forward, where to position planes, when to launch strikes, how to conceal readiness, depended on their work. Outside HYPO, the Pacific remained a theater of uncertainty. Ships steamed across vast waters, pilots trained for missions they did not yet fully understand, and the enemy's fleet moved under the false security of their own codes. But in Tokyo, senior admirals, steeped in confidence and accustomed to victory, could not fathom that the whispers of their meticulously encrypted plans had been captured and understood. Their arrogance would be a liability, a crack in the armor that HYPO had silently widened. The battle of codes of intellect had set the stage for the coming clash. One small team of analysts had rewritten the rules of engagement before a single carrier took flight. Every number, every cipher, every sleepless night had forged a weapon more precise than torpedoes or bombs. The Americans knew where the Japanese would strike, and for the first time in months, the tide, invisible, cerebral, unstoppable, began to turn. In the heart of Tokyo, deep within the steel and stone of the Imperial Navy's headquarters, the war was being waged over maps, charts, and measured words rather than guns. War rooms smelled faintly of tobacco smoke, mingling with the acrid scent of ink and polished wood. Long tables were draped with charts of the Pacific, from the Aleutians to the coral reefs of the Central Pacific, each island and atoll marked with precise coordinates, fuel depots, and airstrips. Officers in crisp uniforms hovered over these maps, pointing with confidence at projected movements, their voices low but certain, carrying the cadence of men who believed the tide of history had already bent in their favor. At the center of it all, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto watched with an inscrutable expression. A man of intellect and foresight, he understood the danger of underestimating an industrial powerhouse like the United States. Yet even his strategic brilliance was constrained by the rigid hierarchy of the Imperial Navy, where deference to rank often outweighed caution. Around him, admirals such as Chuichi Nagumo and Madame Ugaki conducted their planning with a conviction born of repeated victories. Every motion, every decision, was filtered through a culture that prized honor, obedience, and a near-religious confidence in their own superiority. Reports flowed in from intelligence officers, subtle hints of unusual American activity in the Central Pacific. Reconnaissance sightings, intercepted communications, and coded chatter suggested that the Americans were not entirely blind. But these messages were often softened, diluted by junior officers who feared the embarrassment of delivering inconvenient truths. Cultural norms dictated restraint, and in the echo chamber of high command, caution was mistaken for timidity. Dismissive comments echoed through the room. "The Americans will not recover so quickly," one officer insisted. "Their carriers are still fleeing the Pacific," another assured, glancing at the maps as if the ocean itself could be commanded by will alone. The obsession with luring American carriers into a trap became a lens through which all intelligence was filtered. Yamamoto's warnings were weighed against the collective pride of his staff, and the possibility that the enemy might already know their plans seemed almost unthinkable. Every discussion reinforced the belief that the coming battle would be decisive, a demonstration of Japanese naval superiority that would secure the Pacific for years to come. Meanwhile, halfway across the ocean, the United States quietly maneuvered its own forces. The battered but resilient aircraft carrier USS Yorktown had been patched, refueled, and readied for combat, alongside Enterprise and Hornet. Naval aviators trained tirelessly, their eyes scanning the horizon, their planes loaded and armed, crews aware that the success of the coming battle would depend on precision, timing, and the smallest margins of error. Every move was a mirror image of the Japanese assumption. America was positioning itself not in retreat, but to strike. The contrast could not have been starker. In Tokyo, confidence was absolute, almost arrogant, blind to the shadows of HYPO's code-breaking. In Pearl Harbor, in the quiet of the Pacific, 3 American carriers readied themselves to intercept a force that believed it had already won. The psychological weight within the Japanese war rooms was immense. Though unrecognized, pride, certainty, and hierarchical rigidity conspired to blind them to the looming threat. As maps were folded, messages dispatched, and plans finalized, the stage was set. A proud fleet would sail with full confidence, certain of victory, unaware that every move had already been anticipated, calculated, and prepared for by unseen hands. The coming battle would not just be a clash of ships and planes. It would be a collision of human overconfidence and relentless preparation, of hubris and hidden intellect. Tokyo believed America would walk into a perfect ambush, unaware they were sailing into one themselves. June 4, 1942. The morning light cast long shadows across the flight decks of the Japanese carrier strike force. Hangar crews moved with precision born of months of rehearsed routine, hoisting torpedoes and bombs onto waiting planes. The smell of oil and heated metal thick in the air. Deck officers shouted orders above the roar of engines, and Mitsubishi A6M0s sprang into the sky, their engines screaming as they formed into tight, disciplined formations. The rhythm of preparation was mechanical, confident, as if victory were not a possibility to be earned, but a certainty. Yet beneath that calm, unseen threads of chaos were beginning to weave themselves. On Midway, American defenders had already spotted the approaching fleet. Radar screens and lookouts provided early warning, but more than that, years of meticulous intelligence had given them an almost impossible advantage. Aircraft from Midway took to the skies in swift, disciplined waves, ready to confront the Japanese advance. Bombs dropped on the atoll, signaling not vulnerability but awareness. The island was no longer a passive target. It had become a trap. Confusion rippled through the decks of the Japanese carriers. Officers exchanged stunned glances. "How did they know?" one asked under his breath. "Why are they already airborne?" The questions went unanswered, drowned by the thunder of engines and the staccato reports of torpedoes hitting targets below. On board, the disciplined routines that had carried them through Singapore, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies began to falter under the weight of uncertainty. Northeast of Midway, 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the recently repaired Yorktown lay hidden, their decks alive with movement. Torpedo bombers and dive bombers readied themselves, engines humming in anticipation. The first waves were nearly annihilated. Pilots and crews fell victim to Japanese Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire, yet their sacrifice was not in vain. Each attack drew enemy fighters upward. Each moment bought precious time for the waves that followed. Back on the Japanese bridge, dread began to replace confidence. Radio reports, once routine, now carried a grim weight. American carriers had been sighted. Aircraft were attacking from angles no one had predicted. The calculations and assumptions that had guided Nagumo and his staff now seemed fragile and inadequate. Reports confirmed it. 3 U.S. carriers were in position, ready to strike. Shock spread across the bridge, palpable among even the most seasoned officers. This was never supposed to happen. Then, as if the universe itself had intervened, SBD dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown emerged from the clouds. In perfect coordination, they dropped their payloads onto the Japanese carriers below. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu erupted in fire almost simultaneously. Explosions tore through the flight decks, sending smoke and flames skyward. The precision of the attack was overwhelming. The carriers, symbols of imperial pride and invincibility, were transformed into infernos within minutes. In that instant, the consequences of overconfidence and rigid hierarchy crystallized. Every assumption, every dismissive glance at intelligence, every softened warning culminated in a single, horrifying truth. Suddenly, the admirals who had dismissed every warning realized the truth and watched their empire's pride burn before their eyes. The morning after the battle, the Pacific seemed almost serene. Yet across the waters once dominated by Japanese carriers, a different scene unfolded. Smoke rose in black plumes from the smoldering remnants of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and later that night, Huryu. 4 of Japan's frontline carriers had been lost, along with 248 aircraft, many piloted by the Navy's most seasoned aviators, men whose skill had been honed over years of combat in China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands. Some were gone without trace, their final letters home never delivered, leaving families with only the void of absence. The scale of the loss reverberated not just through the fleet, but through the very fabric of Japan's naval culture. In Tokyo, official communiques attempted to minimize the disaster. Newspapers described the engagements with careful euphemism. The names of lost ships and aircrews were often omitted or blurred. Behind closed doors, however, the atmosphere was far from controlled. Shock and disbelief pervaded the highest echelons of the Imperial Navy. Senior officers exchanged hushed conversations, assigning blame, defending past decisions, and questioning whether hubris had carried them too far. Yamamoto, normally composed and commanding, privately acknowledged what few dared to admit aloud. The war had shifted. The offensive initiative was gone. From this point forward, Japan would fight to hold what it had taken, rather than take what it had not. Across the ocean, the United States absorbed the news with a different rhythm. Industrial production, once constrained by months of emergency mobilization, began to assert itself. Morale soared as Americans realized that a decisive strategic blow had been struck, and the hope that had seemed distant after Pearl Harbor was now tangible. Carriers repaired, aircrew trained, and shipyards churned with renewed energy, laying the foundations for a campaign that would carry the Pacific War toward eventual victory. Yet Midway was more than a tactical victory. It was a psychological reckoning for the Japanese high command. Intelligence ignored, dissent suppressed, and the rigid culture of hierarchy had yielded catastrophe. Experienced aviators were gone. The lessons of battle were written in fire and wreckage. The disaster forced reflection on assumptions, on arrogance, on the human cost of command decisions insulated from reality. Yamamoto and his staff, for all their skill and foresight, were confronted with a truth they had long sought to avoid. Even brilliance could be undone by blindness to warning. Letters unopened, pilots buried at sea, carriers aflame, Midway carved an indelible mark into the Pacific War. The echoes traveled far beyond the battlefield, reshaping strategy, morale, and the very understanding of what the Imperial Navy could endure. For America, it was the dawn of a new confidence. For Japan, the beginning of a defensive struggle that would grow ever more desperate with each passing month. In the end, the warnings were not silent, they were simply unheard, and at Midway the Pacific changed forever.